Over the past 10 years, there have been a lot of incredibly popular Spider-Man projects, but arguably none are as popular as Marvel's Spider-Man for the PS4. Developed by Insomniac and later remastered for the PS5, not only is this take on the webhead an excellent game in its own right, but it's truly one of my favorite Spider-Man stories told in any medium. I don't have nearly the time I used to play video games anymore, and I generally have to use that time pretty wisely, but I cannot tell you how often I'm inspired to just throw on Spider-Man and swing around the city. It's a game that genuinely makes you feel like Spider-Man, but that wouldn't mean nearly as much if it didn't deliver such a high-quality Spider-Man story. So, today, let's swing through Manhattan at breakneck speeds and really dive into one of my favorite video games of all time, Marvel's Spider-Man. Marvel's Spider-Man came just after a time where most Marvel video games were tied to film releases. Spider-Man in particular was coming off of video game adaptations of the Amazing Spider-Man series of movies. According to Marvel Games Senior Vice President Jay Ong, this didn't give developers enough time to create quality video game experiences, and so Marvel opted to change their approach. Instead of tying the game to Spider-Man Homecoming, which released just a year before this game, they tasked Insomniac with creating an original adaptation of the character. Rather than creating a game that's secondary to a major film or comic book release, they could create something that stands on its own and gets people excited about the character in a new way. While Insomniac was initially reluctant, given that this would be their first non-original property that they developed for, the possibilities of a Spider-Man game really excited the studio, and despite the weight of expectations that came with not just Spider-Man's history as a character, but his long history in video games as well, Insomniac took on the project and began researching. And they were right to be excited. We've seen through countless different pieces of media that Spider-Man's wealth of characters and history can be adapted in so many different ways while still delivering high quality storytelling. This original video game adaptation is no different. And fortunately, the team at Insomniac understood what made Spider-Man and Peter Parker appealing as a character. Here's a quote from the creative director of the game, Brian Intihar. "I feel like he's the most relatable of heroes. As much as I love Tony Stark, it's harder to identify with a billionaire. As much as I love Thor, it's hard to identify with a god. Peter makes mistakes, he has ups and downs in his career, his relationships, his family. I think we can all relate to that." They were also quick to recognize how integral Peter's life/hero balance or imbalance is to his character. As they put it, when Spider-Man wins, Peter Parker loses. And this is something we see time and time again throughout this entire game in major and minor plot points. I think the smartest thing that Insomniac did with this adaptation was begin the story years into Spider-Man's career, rather than rehash the origin story we've all seen countless times. This has some very clear advantages when world building for this version of the webhead, tapping into an existing history of character relationships, as well as allowing a good number of villains from his rogue gallery to dip in and out of the story. The pacing would have been a real struggle if Peter needed to be introduced to every single villain that makes an appearance over the course of the game. Instead, they have a shared history that we can infer a ton about through their interactions and battles. In fact, Marvel's Spider-Man does an unbelievable job world building and establishing Peter's history through visual storytelling in the opening shot alone. Photos Peter took of New York, photos of May and Ben, as well as Peter with MJ and Harry, a police scanner, Peter and May at Feast, Peter's various gadget designs for Spidey, and some of the gadgets themselves, cheap takeout, a magazine with Norman Osborn on the cover, Peter's empty savings jars for vacation and a laptop, his never-ending work tinkering with his suit, Daily Bugle headlines showing that Spidey has already faced off against Scorpion, Electro, Fisk, Rhino, and Vulture, a dozen post-it notes showing how far behind he is on his chores, errands, and rent, and even a printout from Uncle Ben's funeral. And as he wakes up to the news that the cops are heading for Fisk Tower, we get a perfect little microcosm of the Spider-Man dilemma. A final notice for Peter's rent slips under the door, and he glances between the notice and the police scanner app on his phone before jumping out the window and heading towards Kingpin, perfectly transitioning into the gameplay for the very first time. Truly such a great introduction to this version of the character and segue into the game, but these little details throughout not only show a fundamental understanding of what makes Spider-Man such a compelling character, but also establish exactly where he is in his life, which is helpful context even for the most devoted Spidey fans. The game also does such an amazing job storytelling through dialogue while you're traversing across New York City, which is so smart. Swinging around doesn't really get old, but it keeps the pacing of the game really brisk when you can learn important plot points as you're moving through the city. Even in this opening swing sequence, we get some key backstory details as Spidey is gaining info for the Fisk confrontation, while he's talking to Detective Watanabe.
Mind if I join in on the fun? You know how his lawyers are. This one needs to go by the book.
Come on, Yuri. I've been waiting 8 years for this.
So we know exactly how long Peter's been operating as Spidey, and that the takedown of Wilson Fisk has been a long time coming. This entire first hour not only does an incredible job rolling you through various tutorials at a great pace, but showcasing this major inciting incident that fundamentally changes the power dynamics in New York City and sets the stage for the entire game. After traversing Fisk Tower, we get our first real boss fight, taking on Fisk. This game pretty seamlessly transitions between gameplay and cutscenes, and these boss fights in particular show this off really, really well. But we also get a great showcase of the excellent performances in this game.
Writing your memoirs? Don't forget the hyphen between spider and man.
Get the chopper ready. I won't be long.
This seems like as good a time as any to hype up Yuri Lowenthal's incredible performance as Peter and Spidey. He is truly one of the primary reasons this game's story works so well. An incredible balance of quippy confidence as Spidey and a reserved, wistful nature as Peter, all while maintaining genuine relatability. This is one of my all-time favorite iterations of the character. Obviously, the writing goes a long way here too, but Yuri sells it.
Gotta go. Hey, good luck, Willie. I have a feeling you're gonna need it.
I'm the one who kept order in this city! 1 month! In 1 month you'll wish you had me back!
This is such a smart inciting incident to kick off the game. Something very firmly planted in Peter/Spidey's history, a momentous milestone in his career, but something that completely destabilizes the hierarchy of power in the city and justifies the massive influx of problems that come our way throughout the narrative. And the game really slow rolls some great reveals too, realizing that the audience is likely very familiar with Spider-Man's wide history of characters. Early on, Peter gets a call from his boss, whose identity is not yet revealed, chastising him for being late. But after the Fisk takedown, when Peter finally arrives at work, we get this incredible shot revealing that Peter's boss is Otto Octavius. And honestly, this relationship is an absolute highlight of the game. It feels like they take the little hint of mentorship between the pair we saw in Raimi's Spider-Man 2 and expand it into a full-blown narrative arc. They've got an ongoing working history to the point where Otto isn't just Peter's boss, he's his friend. And this not only creates for a really compelling dynamic, but an incredibly tragic downfall. They even have this great suspenseful sequence where you think Otto discovers Peter's secret.
I only wish you told me sooner.
I wanted to, but I was afraid that if word got out, my family might be in danger.
Yes. I guess if you design his equipment, you're bound to be a target too.
Such a funny twist, but it also helps establish a lot about this version of Otto. Peter and Otto's research is groundbreaking, but it's all meant to help people in need. This is also a concept slightly pulled from Raimi's version. Otto doesn't have any selfish motives here. He's a good man using his knowledge and abilities with responsibility, so it's no wonder that he and Peter have such a connection. He even ends up wanting to help Peter design gear for Spidey, and I love this email that he sends Pete. It really establishes their relationship in this version of Otto.
The revelation of your second job as Spider-Man suit crafter, is that the right term? Is a reminder of the good man and partner you are. No matter how hard you work, you still find time to help others.
In fact, that iconic white spider suit that Insomniac Spider-Man is known for was designed by Otto in the game, which is such a cool idea in my opinion. I know the suit can be a bit controversial, and it's far from my favorite Spidey suit out there, but I love that this version of Spider-Man has such specific iconography that sets him apart visually, and I actually really like the white spider itself, if I'm being honest. The sequence after Peter uses Otto's designs for the new suit is really great, with Spidey swinging through New York showing off the new drip.
Coming through.
Looking good, Spidey!
Hello, New York!
I really can't say enough about how well this game balances the story with introducing various gameplay elements. The opening sequence in Fisk Tower Raid teaches you all of the swinging mechanics as well as the majority of the fight mechanics. Throughout the opening hour and a half, it starts to introduce various tasks and collectibles for traversing the world map, starting with finding cell towers to establish the world map. Over the course of the game, more objectives across New York are revealed, and as long as you're mostly knocking stuff off the list as you traverse the city, like finding backpacks, taking photos of landmarks, working on research stations, it then never actually feels too overwhelming. Though later in the game, 100%ing some things can get a little tedious. But the game's narrative is so perfectly honed in on establishing its characters super economically over the first few hours of the game. Next up, they introduce us to May, who helps Martin Lee run Feast in this universe. We saw the MCU co-opt this type of occupation for May, and honestly, I don't blame them. I think giving May a little bit more of a proactive life and career not only ties into Spider-Man narratives effectively, but it feels like something May should be doing after Ben's death. death, inspired to take responsibility and do what she can to help, like Ben. This first scene also establishes Peter and May's dynamic, as Peter tries to distract her from her surprise party reveal, leading to May simply being concerned for Pete's well-being. But Peter's words about May go so far to tell us what she's all about.
What is it? Come on, you can tell me.
These past few years, you helping me through college and working here, and sacrificing so much and asking for nothing. I just wish there were more people like you in the world.
May also lets slip that she's disappointed that Pete and MJ aren't together anymore, and I think that leaving Pete's love life in this precarious position was such a smart move for the game, establishing that Pete and MJ have significant history with seemingly unfinished business. And personally, I really love the way they drop MJ into the story for the first time.
Don't move.
Buddy, if I had a nickel for every don't move...
Hey, Pete.
So they immediately established that Pete has already revealed his secret identity to MJ in this world. They've got a lot of history and some great chemistry. Pete trying to protect MJ, but MJ being stubborn and trying to keep chasing down the lead. That's good stuff, I like it. This version of MJ is actually a great example of something I really respect about this game. There are aspects of this world and these characters in the game that are not my personal favorite choices for a Spider-Man narrative, but I think they mostly made the exact right choices for the world and these characters in a video game. In this case, I understand the people who are not crazy about the MJ investigative reporter angle. My personal taste is that I actually really like MJ as a model/actress or party girl. This can feel a little bit too Lois Lane, you know? However, MJ as an investigative reporter is a perfect way to naturally tie her into the ongoing narrative and gameplay. With MJ doing parallel investigations to Peter and then relaying that information to Pete, you're able to tie her into the story really effectively. It's really economic storytelling, directly tying Pete and MJ's reconnection and reconciliation with any and all ongoing story points, which is really helpful in such a robust narrative. There are other aspects of this game that I feel similarly about. I think in general, things are a bit more militarized than I would normally care for in my Spider-Man media, just countless encounters with gangs and even armies and armor-clad sentries later. However, this again makes sense for a video game. Consistent enemy encounters and increasingly dangerous scenarios help escalate the stakes in a video game context. It feels like almost every choice is justified, even if it isn't my personal general preference for a Spider-Man story. Though I do understand why people aren't huge fans of the MJ missions themselves. They can be a bit tedious, and obviously just being a person after being Spider-Man is a severe de-escalation. But I do personally enjoy the info about her and Pete's history that you can glean if you're willing to dig into the details during the missions. In this first one, if you go look at every piece of art in the auction house, you'll usually get a revealing monologue from MJ.
Fist cut Peter open like a pork sausage with this the first time they fought. Pete got away, collapsed in my yard half dead, and I had to steal my dad's car to drive him to the ER. The first of many Nurse MJ moments. Too many.
It's a cool way to get a little insight into the character's history and relationship, and even provides context for why their romantic relationship maybe hasn't worked out. It's not necessary for the ongoing narrative, but if you want to dig a little deeper, the option is there. I also like how this little chance encounter basically opens the door for Peter and MJ to reconnect.
Mix? Like the last 6 months never happened?
Pete and MJ have such great chemistry in this world too, and they do such a great job showcasing their connection and care for each other while further establishing some of the most important aspects of this narrative.
You know Oscorp would hire you in a heartbeat, right? One phone call to hair.
Sure, but Dr. Octavius's work will help millions. I'm right where I want to be, right where I should be.
Almost sounds like it's more important than your other job. I've never heard you talk like that before.
Man, that's great stuff. This entire scene has so much subtext. I love watching them dance around the serious discussion they should be having about their relationship. Quality Spidey relationship drama right there.
Love seeing you two together again. You always were my favorites.
The narrative overall escalates really naturally. They introduce new threats like the Demon Gang and throw in quick detours with classic villains like the Shocker chase down. It's all paced really well, progressing the narrative without feeling like it's focusing on any one thing for too long. And then, as they achieve their biggest success scientifically, Otto and Peter's hopes are dashed entirely. Norman Osborn revokes their grant and takes their research and equipment. This scene does a great job revealing key pieces of info about characters and hinting at their histories.
Mr. Osborn.
Oh, please. How long have we known each other? It's Mr. Mayor.
It's Norman.
Norman!
Norman, what do you think you're doing?
Not only does this establish that Norman is the mayor, but it's basically Norman using his power to steal Otto's research for his own gain. The first step in Otto's tragic and inevitable downfall. I love that this path in the story stems from a place of desperation. A man who is trying so hard to do good, but is being stopped by more powerful, selfish forces. It's sort of a perfect Spider-Man narrative. I also like that this story establishes Norman and Otto before either of them have become Doc Ock or Green Goblin. That's a little unusual for this deep in Spider-Man's career, but it saves his most iconic villains for these stories. And after the sequence without the grant, Otto can't afford to pay Peter anymore. Another example of how this game is always balancing wins and losses between Peter and Spidey. Another thing I love about this game is that since this is later in Peter's career, they gradually start establishing a little bit of Miles Morales narrative in this very first game, first introducing his dad, Jeff Davis.
Officer Davis. Call me Jeff. And you are? Just messing with you. My son's a big fan.
I think introducing Jeff first was a smart move. You get to do a pretty cool investigative mission with him before things escalate into a high-speed chase, and as Spidey is stopping a gas truck from falling on the train tracks, Jeff saves his life not once, but twice. And this works great within the narrative because Peter feels he owes a bit of a debt to Jeff, and also sees that Jeff sort of carries that same great responsibility mantra that he does, which is especially apparent in his tragic death scene as the Demon Gang attacks the mayoral rally where Jeff is being honored. In this universe, Miles is a big Spidey fanatic, and his introductory shot is perfect, grabbing a quick video of Spider-Man after he stops a helicopter from crashing into the street below. This is shortly before that aforementioned rally. Miles is one of 3 playable characters in the game, though he just has a couple short missions, but the first is without a doubt the most brutal. After the attack on the rally, he saves his mom and goes in deeper to find his dad. The imagery here is actually wildly violent, and though there isn't much blood, it did make me question if this game could have ever been rated M. Executions, dead bodies, it's pretty gnarly. It's really interesting though, this game actually came out just a few months before Into the Spider-Verse, and these were probably the 2 highest profile adaptations of Miles as a character so far, and both stories actually decided to give Miles his own Uncle Ben moment, a tragic origin point. Obviously Into the Spider-Verse opted to use Uncle Aaron for their narrative, and these Insomniac games go with his father, Jeff, and I think these instincts for both adaptations were absolutely spot on, an incredibly smart decision narratively to tie Miles into the larger Spider-Man mythos. In the comics, Miles doesn't really have one of these Uncle Ben moments before or around the time he becomes Spider-Man. His father ends up bailing on him after learning that he becomes Spider-Man, and his uncle actually just tries to use his powers for his own personal gain, which are also tragic in their own ways. Later in the comics, his mother does get killed by Venom, which is both devastating and also has me terrified for Rio in the upcoming Spider-Man 2, but they didn't really give him a formal parallel to the death of Uncle Ben, at least in the comic books. I just think it's really interesting that both of these incredible Spider-Man adaptations that were developed at the same time both had the inclination to bolster Miles' origin in this way. Both improvements to his comic book origins, in my opinion. But the thing that I actually really love about the Insomniac adaptation of Miles is the fact that his origin is tied to an active Spider-Man. I know most other adaptations have him taking over after Peter's death, but I love Peter and Spidey acting as an active mentor to Miles. And it even begins in this game before Miles is bit by the spider.
I know you don't know me, but I just wanted to say, I know what you're going through.
I think some of this ties back to Peter feeling like he owes a debt to Jeff for saving his life. Also, he sees a little bit of himself in Miles, but they do a great job showing Peter's attempts to connect with Miles without sacrificing that grieving period for Miles himself. There's a really heart-wrenching scene after Miles starts to help out at Feast, where he helps fix an old TV, only for it to reveal a news report about his father is playing at that very moment. Here he is trying to do something good for the world to help his healing, and he's confronted with his pain. En route to his first volunteer day, Miles is mugged and saved by Spidey. It's fun to see Miles just geek out about meeting him, but even cooler is what happens after Spidey tries to give him advice.
It's easy for you to say, sorry, I just can't do what you do.
All right, put him up.
Seriously?
Yeah, come on.
I genuinely love this sequence. Peter knowing that Miles lost his father figure, actively recognizing what it would mean to him to get a personal fighting lesson from his hero, and it really starts to introduce that mentor role he takes on, further seen in the Miles Morales game. And I love the way this escalates too. Later in the game, Spidey and MJ save Miles and May from a burning Feast building, and it culminates in Peter realizing he can't really do everything alone. Without MJ, May and Miles might not have made it out of the fire, and without Miles and MJ, Peter might not have made it out of the fire. And so, he, Miles, and MJ sort of form this trio at this point.
Ms. Watson and I were just talking strategy.
Strategy?
That's right. The city is in danger. It needs our help.
All of our help.
All right, well, call the play, coach.
Though this game doesn't technically contain Peter's Spider-Man origin story, it does have a Spider-Man origin, that of course being Miles. And I think this was such a smart move. Insomniac's writing team was both thinking ahead and building out their own Spideyverse in a unique way. I especially love the first post-credit scene for a few reasons. Miles trusts Peter enough to reveal his newfound Spidey powers to him. He doesn't know Peter is Spider-Man yet, but through their forming friendship and mentorship at Feast, he trusts Peter enough for him to be the one he asks for advice about this. And I love even more that Peter immediately reveals to him that he is Spider-Man as well. The character relationships are just really well handled in these games. Their bonds form and escalate really naturally, and the characters all have such great chemistry.
You have his number. Are you Spider-Man's girlfriend?
Speaking of which, the Peter and MJ reconciliation is another narrative highlight. I really appreciate how much character and relationship development the game is able to pack in, largely because it doesn't all have to be done via cutscenes. Peter and MJ's serendipitous meeting early on in the game leads to them working together and reconnecting throughout the rest of the game. And there's a great little arc in regards to how Peter treats MJ. Reading between the lines, it seems like once Peter revealed his identity to MJ, he became a bit overbearing, out of fear that something might happen to her. A very Spider-Man-like fear to have, a great hiccup to establish in their relationship because it's an understandable issue for them to work through. When Pete first runs into MJ early in the game, he's horrified that she put herself in danger, and of course with this new investigative career, MJ continues to do this, but without telling Peter. But you can tell that MJ wants Peter to be a part of all of this.
What if we teamed up?
What, you want to be my sidekick?
No, not a sidekick. A partner.
This fully comes to a head at the Sable base when MJ nearly gets the information she needs before Peter busts in to try and protect her and totally blows it.
Definitely not a Sable guy. Sorry, Charlie. Okay, time to go.
No, he knows something.
I think from here they do a great job showing Peter start to accept that MJ is able to make her own decisions. The next MJ mission takes place at Grand Central Station. MJ and a group of people are held hostage. In this one, you actively work with Peter, helping direct who he should web up to help her sneak around and free everybody. Between this and MJ's help saving Miles and May at the Burning Feast building, Peter really starts to turn a corner on how he views their relationship. For the final MJ mission, MJ fully tells Peter ahead of time that she's going to sneak into Norman's penthouse, instead of keeping it a secret. Peter even acts as her support, rather than vice versa, keeping an eye on the building and aiding in her daring escape.
You are crazy.
You're amazing.
While the game itself is so much fun, jam-packed with action, customizability, and wildly inventive sequences, the heart is absolutely the character relationships. But let's actually take a moment to geek out about that gameplay. It's cliche to say, but the game literally makes you feel like Spider-Man. Not just through the amazing mechanics allowing you to swing through all of Manhattan, but through the almost overwhelming number of things that require your attention. While it can be a lot to take in as a player, I think this is intentional to make you feel like Peter Parker. To make you feel like there are so many things that you need to try and fix that you couldn't possibly balance all of them alongside any semblance of a social life. It's just such an incredible illustration of the Spider-Man dilemma, the struggle to live up to your great responsibility and live a fulfilling life of your own. Some of the action sequences in this game, particularly the one where Spidey has to stop a crane from falling down into the city, are so incredible to experience. Yeah, action commands themselves aren't particularly demanding, but I don't actually care when it's showcasing such gorgeously cinematic sequences. The game seamlessly blends these with the ongoing gameplay and cutscenes. Everything just flows so perfectly. I know a lot of people prefer a Spider-Man that isn't overly reliant on gadgets, but in the context of a video game and a Peter Parker that's been at it for 8 years, I think the various tools in your arsenal make for some incredibly fun combat. Not to mention the abilities and customization options. The massive variety of suit options from Spidey's history are so much fun. And even though I'd love to see the character of Ben Reilly properly introduced in these games in some capacity, my first playthrough was basically done entirely in the Scarlet Spider outfit, an all-time fave. And don't even get me started on the score. I have no idea how they've managed to create so many unique Spider-Man themes and still manage to win me over time and time again. This has become one of my go-to scores to listen to while I read Spider-Man comics though. It's so good. Like I said, obviously all of this added together creates for one absolutely incredible package, but that package would not be anything if the story and character relationships weren't successful. We've already talked talked about how great a job they do setting up Peter and Octavius' relationship, and we'll talk later about how all that culminates in an absolutely stunning finale. But just as important is Otto's tragic fall into villainy. Mostly through voicemails and calls that Otto leaves Peter, we hear how Otto's plans have shifted from simple prosthetics to something new, something even better and more versatile than the human arm, which of course leads to the incredible reveal of the Ock arms for the very first time, alongside the devastating reveal that Otto has a neurological disorder that is slowly destroying his motor functions, making the Ock arms his potential saving grace. These are the things that make Insomniac's Doc Ock so perfectly executed. Of course, we all know Octavius becomes Dr. Octopus. Every Spider-Man fan on Earth knows this. But what's brilliant about this story is that they invest you in Octavius' struggles, they invest you in his relationship to Peter, so that when the turn finally comes, you don't want it to happen.
We're all safer now than we have ever been.
Liar!
You have no idea what you're in for.
And they somehow manage to continually escalate this into even more devastating territory. But we'll get to the endgame soon enough. Ock isn't the only compelling villain either. The character work they do with Martin Lee, aka Mr. Negative, is really impressive. Mr. Negative is definitely the newest Spider-Man villain utilized in the game, only first being introduced in the comics in 2007. I think for a lot of people, it can be hard to be invested in the less iconic Spidey villains when they're utilized, but this is absolutely not the case here. Again, primarily because of how this story ties so deeply into the other characters. Not only is Martin Lee Aunt May's boss at Feast, adding a personal connection for Peter, but his tragic backstory ties him to both Otto and Norman Osborn, with the devastating reveal that their experiments on Devil's Breath gave Lee his abilities, and also led to those abilities killing his parents. It's another beautiful example of Insomniac's character-first approach. It's why this game works so well. Even introducing a world where Peter has been Spider-Man for years, they don't skip steps when introducing the audience to these versions of the characters. Even the filler villains in this game are utilized really well. Electro, Vulture, Rhino, and Scorpion are all introduced at a major turning point in the game, and through dialogue and gameplay, we understand exactly how much history they have with Spidey and how dangerous they are. This entire action sequence at the raft is incredible, just beautifully cinematic while also making the player feel the sense of urgency. We don't need to dive deep into their backstories because their history with Spider-Man, alongside the dire nature of their escape, add all of the stakes to the story that we need, especially with the revelation that all of them, along with Martin Lee, are now being directed by Octavius. This game does something I didn't realize was possible. It makes the formation of the Sinister Six terrifying, despite doing it within one single narrative. Though we had never met these versions of 4 of the villains before the raft escape event, the formation itself is wildly compelling, especially with the Ock leadership reveal. The way Octavius' direction helps the group reach their full potential is probably my favorite way to portray the Sinister Six, very reminiscent of how Spectacular Spider-Man handled it. The way the narrative utilizes Silver Sable was also pretty brilliant, making her an antagonist to Spider-Man, but not a full-blown villain, with Norman hiring her and her agents as a personal army in the wake of all of the terrorist attacks on the city. Even the side villains add so much to this universe. There's an entire side mission with Tombstone that isn't even required to beat the game, but having all of these villains operating simultaneously make the world feel more lived in. The way the demons use a street-level villain like Shocker also adds to this feeling. They even give other characters a presence in the gameplay without actually introducing them into the ongoing narrative. Jameson is a great example, who's retired from the Daily Bugle and now runs the podcast that Spidey listens to constantly. As you're swinging across the city, you're regularly treated to a dose of menace accusations. Such a smart way to incorporate his presence into this version of New York without adding him to the narrative or making you read newspaper headlines. Black Cat is incorporated similarly. There's a side mission where she leads you on a wild goose chase across the city to track down these cat dolls.
Been thinking about you a lot lately. We were good together, weren't we? Maybe it's time to reignite the flame.
And once you find all these locations, you learn that she played Spidey and used the dolls to break her gear out from the police precinct, which is so perfectly Felicia. I've said it before, but it's just such economic storytelling. There's an entire Black Cat subplot that establishes so much about her history with Spidey without showing her in a single cutscene, at least until the DLC. But probably my favorite example of one of these characters that has a presence without being in the actual narrative is Harry Osborn. You hear Harry via voice recordings left for Peter on his Oscorp research stations across the city, and most of them lead to Peter adding insightful commentary about their friendship in this universe. There are even some phone calls with MJ reminiscing about the old days when it was just the three of them, before Harry left for his mysterious Europe trip. And as a player, it's pretty easy to get the sense that there's more going on with Harry's absence, but that doesn't make the reveal for the characters any less impactful. During a mission to Norman's penthouse, MJ discovers that Harry isn't in Europe. He's been undergoing treatment for a terminal illness, the same one that killed his mother. I honestly teared up reading Harry's journal entry where he writes a heartfelt apology to Pete and MJ for not telling them sooner. But what's even more brilliant is that this devastating reveal for MJ and Peter also ties directly into the core narrative here. Norman's devil breath experiments started as his attempts to save his wife and continued into his attempts to save his son, which leads us to maybe the most underrated villain in the game, Norman Osborn himself. In fact, everything in this game leads back to Norman Osborn. And even though he's a selfish asshole, they even managed to give him empathetic motivations through his relationships. He lost his wife and is doing everything he can to try and save his son at everyone else's expense. Devil's Breath was his early attempts at this, and it did three major things. One, it gave Martin Lee his tragic backstory and motivations to get revenge on Osborn. Two, it created Devil's Breath itself, which causes a major citywide pandemic and quarantine in this narrative. And three, it caused Otto to split from Norman and led to his eventual motivations for revenge. Everything leads back to Norman Osborn. In fact, this seems to be vitally important moving forward as well. As we see in the post-credit scene, Norman seems to be using a symbiote to try and keep Harry alive. By now, we all know that Harry and Venom are both major players in the upcoming Spider-Man 2, once again tying potentially devastating events directly back to Norman. I expect that by the time Spider-Man 3 rolls around, we'll probably be looking at a Green Goblin narrative as the ultimate villain of the trilogy.
The truth is, you were only ever worth a damn when you worked for me. The truth is, you could never accept that I'm better than you. You're a failure, Otto, and you always will be.
And what better transition to the villain of this game, Doc Ock. The final battle against Octavius is perfectly executed. Otto is atop Oscorp Tower with Norman and the anti-serum that can heal everyone infected with Devil's Breath, including Aunt May. Peter goes in thinking that he can appeal to the half of Otto that he looked up to, the hero that inspired him.
Otto, I've worked your whole life to help you.
The battle itself is intense, but nothing hits as hard as the reveal that Otto actually did know that Peter was Spider-Man. Just a devastating betrayal.
I've worshipped you, your mind, your conscience, wanting to help others, the way you never gave up.
But Otto's speech here is one of the most ingenious pieces of writing I've ever seen in any Spider-Man media. The entire reason that Peter was so drawn to Otto as a mentor is because he embodied, with great power comes great responsibility. But here in this final moment they share together, we see how Otto has taken that mantra too far, that he can use that very same code as an excuse to do awful things.
That's because men like us have a duty, a responsibility, to use our talents in the service of others. Even if they don't appreciate it, we have to do what's best for those beneath us, whether they understand it or not.
No, you're wrong! You are everything I wanted to be!
God, I genuinely cannot say enough about how immaculately crafted this relationship is. Built up so beautifully just so it can come crashing down in the most devastating way. Something that so perfectly embodies the tragedies of Peter's life through an iconic legacy character with an amazing new twist on the relationship. Top tier stuff. And it isn't even the most emotional scene in the story. Peter is faced with the ultimate test of his moral fortitude. Use the anti-serum to save May, or lose her while they replicate it so they can save everybody else.
And I am so proud of you. And Ben would be too. All the people you've saved.
I don't know what to do.
Yes, you do.
Devastating doesn't even begin to describe May's death in this game. Over the course of this story, Peter lost his job, his apartment, and his most important role models. His literal mother figure, some of the most important people in his entire life. It's a game that perfectly illustrates the sacrifices that come with being Spider-Man and with doing the right thing. And despite these devastating losses, Peter still moves forward. Despite the non-stop heartbreak, he also gains so much. He saved potentially millions of people from Devil's Breath. He formed incredibly important new friendships and relationships, like with Miles, and even took on a mentor role himself. And of course, he reconnected with Mary Jane, the love of his life. There are so few stories that perfectly encapsulate the Spider-Man experience better than Insomniac Spider-Man, and personally, I cannot wait to see what's coming next. After the massive success of Marvel's Spider-Man, it was obvious that Insomniac would want to follow up with a sequel, but what wasn't as expected was the development of a sort of mid-quel to launch simultaneously with the PS5, Spider-Man Miles Morales. And though the game is quite a bit shorter than his predecessor, it's once again a perfect Spider-Man story, letting us experience Miles' first major outing as Spider-Man and setting the stage for the sequel. Spider-Man Miles Morales might not be as robust as Insomniac's first Spidey game, but it packs a massive emotional punch and gives us a more intimate, street-level experience as Spidey learns the ropes. I've been a fan of Miles Morales for a while, especially after Into the Spider-Verse, and while I was excited for Insomniac's take on the character, I didn't expect them to deliver such a satisfyingly different take on the character than what we had already gotten. I didn't expect to love aspects of Miles' Insomniac story even more than Peter's Insomniac story, and I didn't expect to fall in love with a whole new version of the character. That made me feel even more hyped for the full sequel than I already was. It might venom shock you to learn that I adore Spider-Man Miles Morales, and today, I'm gonna tell you exactly why. So after the first game, Insomniac pretty much immediately began work on a follow-up, but with the dev time it would take to properly elevate the sequel, they also began to work on a bit of an expansion game, a midquel, built on the skeleton of the first game, meant to showcase the first real steps in Miles' journey as Spider-Man. Personally, I could not be happier about this decision. I understand how some people look at the limited amount of content compared to the first game and are disappointed, but for me, I'd love to see one of these midquels between every main entry Spider-Man game, retailing at a lower price point and giving us a satisfying, impactful story that directly builds on the previous games and sets up for the sequel. Yes, please. I'm obviously stoked for the ways the world and gameplay are going to expand in Spider-Man 2, but I'm mostly here for amazing Spider-Man stories and experiences. If you can give me more great stories that stand on the shoulders of the world and game design of the previous entry, I will take that every single time. Plus, I don't really want to wait 5 years for every Spider-Man game experience. As I mentioned in my video about the first game, I really love the way they adapted Miles' origin for the Insomniac verse. I think it elevates the character over the source material while also deftly adapting Miles to this world specifically. Showing Jeff's death as Miles' Uncle Ben moment, and then having both Spidey and Pete step in different areas of Miles' life to help fill that mentor role just really worked for me. It's such a satisfying slow build throughout the first game, and when that post-credit scene hits, it really hits. The DLC for the first game actually also expands on the transition period a bit. As Peter is dealing with Black Cat, Hammerhead, and other threats, there are a handful of phone calls with Miles that show Peter's reluctance to train him. It's fun to see how, even though Peter started being Spidey at age 15, he sees the risks differently now that he's looking at it from adulthood. But it's really satisfying to see Miles win Peter over with his enthusiasm and eagerness to help people, ending in a pretty great final scene that leads perfectly into this game.
Ready?
I think the web shooters are a little tight.
Get used to it. Just try to keep up.
It's a really perfect ending beat, showing Peter's encouragement and confidence in Miles as he takes his first leap of faith. Spider-Man Miles Morales takes place about a year after the end of the first game's DLC, and not only do we see that year-long development of Miles' Spidey training, but a ton of other well-woven plot points that effectively build from the previous game. While we know Miles and his family are from Brooklyn, this game actually sees them move to Harlem. I think functionally this was because Brooklyn was not available in the New York City map from the first game, but I also think it ties really well into this narrative. After Jeff's death, it makes sense that the Moraleses may need to find a new place to live, and I also love the way they tie it into this story, explaining that Rio grew up in Harlem and one of the reasons she's returning to her mother's old apartment is to run for a city council seat. And this connects beautifully to what I actually love the most about this game, the sense of community. Spider-Man Miles Morales is your quintessential friendly neighborhood Spider-Man game. While I love the first one, the massive scale and citywide issues can make it start to feel a bit less friendly neighborhood and a bit bit more Spider Cop. This is not the case this time. The dilemma being focused into one neighborhood actually really benefits not only the game's themes, but the sense that you are actually helping real people. People in the neighborhood that Miles sees every single day. And this is forecasted brilliantly in the opening sequence of the game, with Miles walking up from the subway into his new neighborhood for presumably the first time as a resident. The neighborhood itself looks beautiful from ground level, but it also immediately shows Miles becoming acquainted with his neighbors, helping someone move a couch onto a truck, complimenting the giant Spidey mural that the local artists are painting. It's a great juxtaposition from Peter's opening in the first game, as he's a bit isolated at that point in his life and Spidey career. This sequence shows how important Miles' connection to his new community will be to the story, and these themes are present throughout the entire game, showing just how much these people appreciate that this new Spider-Man is taking the time to meet their needs. We'll talk about this a lot over the entire video. The other major focus of this narrative is not only Miles learning the importance of community and embracing those closest to him, but also stepping up and gaining the confidence to be his own Spider-Man, to step out from Peter's shadow and use his great responsibility his way. But that also comes with the hard truths about being Spider-Man, that the work-life balance is difficult. Again, immediately shown in the opening sequence, as Miles has to bail on buying groceries for his mom to go help Peter make sure Rhino's prison convoy gets through the city safely. Even just this first mission has such a great narrative structure, with Miles' overzealousness to prevent Rhino's container from breaking loose, causing the entire chopper to crash down into the street. Miles and Pete basically have to do damage control to contain Rhino, and Miles struggles to keep up with Pete as they try to stop Rhino's rampage, perfectly illustrates his lack of experience in comparison to Peter. Despite this, Miles saves countless people, and the longer the sequence goes on, the more comfortable he gets in the heat of these dire situations. And by the end, Pete is knocked out, and Miles actually saves the day himself, stopping Rhino with his newly discovered Venom Strike abilities.
Miles, get out of here. Bro. Back the hell?
This entire first mission is Miles' trial by fire, and it's basically a perfect Spider-Man short film. Nothing comes easy for Miles, but he proves himself and doesn't run away when things get tough, even after making a major mistake. It specifically shows Peter that Miles is ready, even if he's still got some work to do, which is why he feels so comfortable leaving town and letting Miles fly solo.
I screwed up today big time with the helicopter.
But then you delivered big time. You saved my bacon, Miles.
It's just a beautiful way to set the stage for the game, ending with Peter giving Miles his first real Spidey suit. But more importantly, it also sets the stage for the relationships that will flounder and flourish over the course of the game. One of my favorite sequences is this Christmas dinner, which both establishes all of the most important players in the game's story and gives us just a genuinely lovely dinner sequence. It gets us properly acquainted with Miles' relationship to both Rio and Genki, both of which play key roles. I'm so glad that this game has really embraced Genki. Though I think it made for a stronger film, Into the Spider-Verse's plan to utilize Genki were abandoned after Spider-Man Homecoming basically gave Ned Leeds the Genki treatment before Spider-Verse released. Across the Spider-Verse didn't really incorporate him back into the story much either, and while those films are amazing, it's just nice to see a key friendship in Miles' life properly explored in a big story like this one, and even impact the gameplay too. Genki is basically your point of contact. He created a Spider-Man app to help Miles track who needs help most, which is also just a genuine gameplay improvement as far as mission tracking goes. The dinner also drops hints about Miles' uncle Aaron and his mother's disapproval of Aaron, and then most importantly, it introduces us to Finn.
Oh yeah, you guys won the middle school science fair at County, right? You made a,
energy converter?
Jinx!
I think it's pretty understandable that Insomniac didn't want to burn any major characters in Spidey's Rogues Gallery for the shorter Miles adventure, so their solution was to adapt a character who was maybe a little underwhelming, for me at least. And I think adapting the Tinkerer into an entirely new character was really effective here. The Tinkerer is one of Spidey's oldest foes, and I have never been much of a fan. An old man who tinkers with stuff, neat. But flipping Phineas Mason into Finn Mason and tying those tinkering and scientific abilities to a younger character while making that a major aspect of her connection to Miles is really smart storytelling. It's just more cleanly and intricately woven. I really appreciate that they didn't linger on Finn's villain identity either. Pretty much the first time we meet the Tinkerer, we learn that she's Finn. No need to draw it out. The important thing is that Miles' personal and superhero lives are at odds with each other. A perfectly Spider-Man dilemma. And this isn't the only changes and additions made to Miles' backstory and characterization. One major thing that happened for Miles as a character between Spider-Man PS4 and this this game was the release of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and it would be disingenuous not to point out that the team at Insomniac definitely took a few cues from the success of that film. Out the gate, the game starts with a pretty banging soundtrack. They definitely used more outside tracks throughout the game's narrative than they did in the last game, and it's really effective here. It gives the game a hipper, younger vibe. Hard not to see this as Spider-Verse's influence creeping in, with that soundtrack being so prominent. On top of that, in this game, one of Miles' hobbies is making music, and it's actually partially how he connects with his uncle Aaron in one of the side missions. Pretty easy to see how this is the Insomniac version of Miles' street art as showcased in the Spider-Verse films. Both are artistic hobbies that Miles' comic book counterpart does not have, and in both instances he bonds with his uncle over them. But I don't actually mind seeing Spider-Verse's influence here. I think both this game and those films elevate Miles as a character in different ways, and it's cool to see some of the best versions of the character influence one another. While this game is more streamlined than the first, they still do a great job economically introducing important elements of the story. While Aaron was hinted at in the Christmas dinner sequence, we're actually introduced to him properly in one of the first solo missions. Miles helps him return power to the local train, an early mission that ties both to the game's themes of community and that important relationship.
1 year unlimited subway pass.
Thanks.
Did I get the name right?
How did you...
Aaron and Miles' relationship is definitely a highlight, both as nephew/uncle and their street-level Spidey Prowler relationship. I'm really happy that this game also decided to make Aaron a more positive presence in Miles' life, like Spider-Verse did, a stark contrast to the comics. And I love that even in this first appearance, we can see that Aaron is repping a Rio Morales poster, still supporting his family despite the friction. Both of these Insomniac Spidey games have a wide array of collectible fetch missions across New York, but I think Aaron's sound mixing mission is easily the most impactful across either game. He encourages Miles to travel to different locations across the city to record specific noises to use in his beat mixing, but what makes them special is that for each sound, Aaron has a story about his life with Miles' dad before Miles was in the picture. It's a tragic but effective way for Miles to learn the details of how Aaron and Jeff's relationship fell apart and how much Aaron regrets that. There are key moments where Miles is betrayed by Aaron here, but his antagonism and attempts to stop Miles are only because he's scared of losing his nephew the way he lost his brother.
Doesn't have to be like this. You, me, hating each other? That's how it happened between me and your dad. I don't want to repeat that.
I don't either. But I can't be the person you want to turn me into. I can't turn my back when people need me. I have to be better than that.
And again, it's another example of something these Insomniac games do so well. Almost every important conflict in these games ties back to relationships in Spider-Man's life. But as I mentioned before, the new angle in this game is Spider-Man's relationship to his specific community in Harlem, and man, do they make it feel alive. In an early mission at Rio's rally, you walk through the street fair with Genki. The lighting is vibrant, and the neighborhood is brimming with life. These street-level experiences do so much to make it feel like you're helping actual people, not random NPCs. In fact, the story is greatly enhanced if you choose to do the optional side missions. Every single side mission in this game is specifically community oriented. Early in the game, you help Teo at Teo's bodega after it was looted, who funny enough has a cat named Spider-Man.
Not you, my cat. Named after the real Spider-Man.
What's so great about this first side mission is how Teo is clearly a Spider-Man stan, but sees Miles as an imposter, not unlike a lot of fans of Spider-Man in the real world. But Miles actually wins Teo over by showing that he cares enough to help, by proving that he is a real Spider-Man.
Spider-Man! Good work, other Spider-Man. Thanks.
Yeah. Of course.
Miles helps the local Feast chapter regain access to their building.
Ah, Spider-Man, you've got perfect timing. Don't know how much longer we would have held out. Thank you.
In another side mission, you literally rescue the owner of Panafuerte from kidnappers, and then return all of these stolen goods back to these local businesses.
You need food too. You're a growing boy. Mira, come by Panafuerte anytime.
Appreciate it, both of you.
Everyone on the block feels the same. You've done us good, Spider-Man.
In probably my favorite side mission, you help out Haley, a deaf street artist who appears countless times over the course of the game, in main missions and side missions. After stopping some of Fisk's thugs from terrorizing a local park, Haley explains exactly what Spidey means to her and to the rest of the community.
It's my home too.
Honestly, if you beat this game without doing these side missions, you didn't get the full experience. They all focus so specifically on Miles' new home and the ways Spidey tangibly makes the community a better place for them. And it shows every single community member that you help show gratitude towards Spidey for his place in that community. It's a perfect distillation of what the Spider-Man experience should look like, and it even ties into the climax, but we'll get there soon. Okay, let's talk about Finn and her character journey here. I've actually seen a lot of criticism aimed at Finn, and I'm gonna be honest, I think there are some pretty important aspects of her backstory that people seem unwilling to see or engage with. Finn's tragic backstory is that she witnessed her brother Rick die as they both tried to shut down Roxxon's new form energy program. Even worse, Simon Krieger watched and mocked them as it happened.
No one's gonna care about a few sick people uptown or a dead engineer.
It is a pretty brutal death, and she saw it happen firsthand. Her only real family. Finn's response to this was to form a gang called the Underground that is hellbent on stopping Roxxon by any means necessary. Looking at Simon Krieger, basically the stand-in for any evil, untouchable CEO, and the system that both put him in place and killed her brother, she did not see any way that he would properly face justice. She was radicalized out of helplessness and fear. But there's more to Finn's actions throughout this game than this backstory, and it once again ties back to those communal themes. When she was younger, Finn had her people, her support system, and those people were her brother and Miles. After Miles gets into Brooklyn Visions, they lose touch and they don't see each other nearly as much. Then she loses her brother tragically, and suddenly Finn has no community. And the community she finds is the Underground, a group of people united by a cause and idea. They become her support system and her reason to keep going. After Miles discovers Finn's identity as the Tinkerer, he convinces her he wants to join the Underground so he can find the new form she stole. When she discovers that this was all a ruse, and Miles reveals to her that he's actually Spider-Man, who the Underground have been actively fighting, Finn feels deeply betrayed. I've seen a lot of criticism about this aspect of her story, because after this revelation, despite nearly reconciling, Finn berates Miles multiple times for lying to her.
I want you to stop lying to me! I'm not gonna let you lie to me again!
The issue with this criticism is that people aren't really reading into the nuances of Finn's backstory with Miles here. Finn is not just mad because Miles lied about wanting to join the Underground, or that he didn't tell her he was Spider-Man. These lies are an extension of Finn's existing resentment towards Miles, and we learn the root of this in the flashback mission as they go to see their experiment at the museum.
I'm gonna miss doing stuff like this with you.
What are you talking about?
Hello? You'll be at Brooklyn Visions next week. I won't.
I'm not gonna vanish off the planet. We'll still hang out.
You'll be busy.
Not that busy. I'm gonna make time for us. Seriously.
Okay.
Miles promises Finn that even though he got into Brooklyn Visions, he wouldn't lose touch with her, that he would make time for his best friend. And over the course of the story, it's made very clear that this did not happen. Through his new school, through the loss of his father, through the move, through Spider-Man training, Miles did not make time for Finn. Finn's resentment towards Miles is because she feels he lied about their friendship. He didn't keep his promise. And the moment she let him back into her life, she feels that he immediately began lying to her again. Despite their near reconciliation, Miles attacking Finn to save Rhino from her revenge-fueled attack was the last straw for her. Miles is the community that continually let her down. Instead of taking another chance on him, she falls back on the community that has been there for her, which happens to be this fringe terrorist organization. And let's be honest, this also mirrors how many people in real life end up feeling an obligation to fringe groups, conspiracists, cults, etc. They fall in so deep into these groups that it becomes far more about the community they gain than it does the actual belief system. Finn's plan to stop Roxxon is flawed. Roxxon will easily survive the Underground attack and maybe even come out on top thanks to their insurance. Large corporations are rarely held accountable, and they will ultimately end up being seen as the victim. Finn absolutely makes selfish decisions and major mistakes. She is 18 years old and stricken with grief and vengeance. She stops seeing how her actions harms others and starts only seeing her own goals because she thinks that's all she has left. Finn has lost everyone she cares about and feels like nobody is listening. She feels entirely abandoned, and she refuses to give up on the goals that were built from that grief. Finn's character journey being so closely tied to losing the healthy community in her life and then turning to an unhealthy one is exactly why it's such a beautiful antithesis of Miles' own own journey. This entire story is about Miles finding his own way to be Spider-Man, and the way he does that is through embracing community, which is actually a little bit of a contrast to Peter. While the moment Peter gives Miles his first real Spidey suit is a beautiful mentor/mentee milestone, the suit itself is a bit awkward. It's bunched up, ill-fitting, it still has knee pads for training, it lives in the shadow of Peter's suit, just like Miles lives in the shadow of Peter. And you can see this in the details. Early in the game when you swing, Miles flails wildly, he seems uncomfortable, but eventually Miles taps into his community and his loved ones.
I said I'd fight for my home. I meant it.
You could have died.
Our family doesn't give up. You know that.
The inspiration he draws from his mother and Genki helps fuel him to find his own way as Spider-Man.
Whenever you say Spider-Man, you always mean the other one. You're Spider-Man. You can fix this. Your way.
And once Miles reveals his new, properly fitting suit, you can see simply by the way he swings how much more comfortable and confident he is being himself. He's not trying to be Peter anymore, he is Spider-Man. In fact, Miles pretty blatantly ignores some of Peter's biggest Spidey advice, which is to keep his identity a complete secret. Again, Peter is a little more isolated. A couple people know his identity, but not many. Miles' identity ends up being revealed to Genki, Rio, Finn, and even more people from his community later in the game. And when he finally reveals that he's Spider-Man to his mother, she sums up Miles' heroism perfectly.
Miles, there is nothing you could ever do or ever be that would make me stop loving you. Nada. You give me strength, Miles. That's all a hero really is. Someone who's brave for the people they love.
And Miles embracing community as a part of his identity as Spider-Man ties intrinsically to not only Finn's parallel journey, but to their history and relationship. One of the major collectible missions is finding these old time capsules that Miles and Finn left around the city. There are so many of them, each one giving more and more insight into how close they actually were. He regrets not maintaining his connection with Finn, he regrets not keeping that promise, he regrets not bolstering his community, and this time he's going to do things differently. After Miles and Finn have their falling out towards the end of the story, there's this really informative little scene between Miles and Genki.
I wanted to say, thanks for always having my back, man.
Miles isn't going to take this new community for granted. He wasn't there for Finn, and now she's on this revenge-driven path, which unbeknownst to her happens to threaten all of Harlem, Miles' new community. The entire climax of the game gorgeously illustrates these themes as you help take on both Roxxon and underground agents, protecting the actual community of Harlem that's basically in the crosshairs of these two awful militant groups. It's always about protecting the people. Finn is so far gone at this point, and so close to her goal, that she isn't remotely willing to hear Miles out until she actually sees evidence that what he's saying is true. And the moment this happens, she does realize she was wrong. And even more importantly, despite the chaos surrounding them, Miles still doesn't give up on her, saving her from falling to her death.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I think when it comes to this narrative, far too much of the discussion is on whether or not Finn is sympathetic or if her sacrifice at the end makes up for her mistakes. Of course, they don't make up for the mistakes, but both of these Spider-Man games have been about relationships. Miles did not do right by his friend after middle school and they drifted apart, and now he has to live wondering if things could have been different if he had been there for her. Finn's path, of course, isn't Miles' fault, but he still let his friend down. And through what he learned over the course of this story, he sees how important it is not to let people slip through the cracks, to be there for them even if they've made mistakes. And Miles fully living that truth in this final showdown with Finn is exactly what showed her the kind of hero he is. Like Rio said, a hero is someone who is brave for the people they love. Despite everything Finn had done to Miles, he still risked himself to save her, and then was willing to risk himself further to save Harlem. And this is what inspired Finn to be a hero in her final moments. In fact, after the game ends, Miles has a phone call with his mom about this exact conflicting feeling, reconciling Finn's sacrifice with her mistakes, and I think Rio puts it best.
You don't need to make a judgment on Finn's life, mijo. Or her death. Just remember who she was and why you loved her.
Finn is important because she's important to Miles. No, her sacrifice doesn't make up for what she did, but this all once again ties beautifully to the themes of community. If you show up for the people who are most important to you, those people will show up for you, which is once again perfectly showcased not just through Finn's sacrifice, but after it as well, as Miles falls back down into Roxxon Plaza. All of the people who Miles helped over the course of this game, Rio, Genki, and the community members from the side missions, they all show up for Miles when he's down, because he showed up for them.
Who is he?
That guy? He's our Spider-Man.
After this sacrifice, after Miles shows up for the community and shows his uncle the importance of great responsibility, Aaron turns on Roxxon and Krieger goes to jail. Aaron has to serve time, but he does the right thing for his community, showing that while Miles and Finn had the same goals, there's a right and wrong way to go about it. This last scene of Miles in his neighborhood perfectly mirrors the first, but now he is with his people, and they have fully embraced him as both Miles and as Spider-Man.
I think we can all learn something from what happened in Harlem. Together, we're stronger. And that having your own neighborhood Spider-Man is pretty great.
Man, I just truly adore this game's narrative. It so beautifully builds up this version of Miles into his own hero through deep personal trials and tribulations. It's an absolute masterclass in theming, tying the importance of community to not just the story, but the major character journeys as well. It sets Miles' journey apart from Peter's and shows that there are different places to focus that great responsibility, and that by being a hero and showing up for those you love most, you can in turn inspire them to rise to that great responsibility themselves. And I have a feeling that Miles is really going to have to show up for those he cares about in Spider-Man 2, especially Peter, and I can't wait to experience that. Insomniac Spider-Man 2 is finally here, and critics are raving. 3 years after the Miles Morales game and 5 years since the original, the highly anticipated sequel is launched to massive acclaim and record-breaking sales for PlayStation, a true testament to not only this series of games, but Spider-Man's lasting cultural appeal. This was easily one of my most anticipated games of all time, as a massive fan of Spider-Man as a whole, and Insomniac's take on the characters. But like great power and great responsibility, with massive hype comes massive expectations. So was I happy with the follow-up? Short answer, yes. Long answer, yes, but I have a lot of feelings about the game's story. And while I do think overall it delivered an unforgettable experience with some of my favorite moments in Spidey history, it does feel like there were maybe a few pieces missing that could have made the narrative feel a tad more cohesive. But that doesn't mean I don't have a ton to gush about. Spider-Man 2 is a triumph in so many ways, and I'm gonna tell you exactly why. Also, just a heads up, this is primarily a dissection of Spider-Man 2's narrative, which means there are going to be spoilers throughout the entire video, so this is your last warning. Alright, still here? Let's do it. During the production of Insomniac's first Spider-Man game, the question of including the symbiote suit as an unlockable costume was posed, and since Insomniac really seems to understand the most important aspects of Spidey's history, they rightfully held off and opted to save the inclusion of this suit for when the narrative demanded it. A really smart move if you ask me. It not only placed significance on its inclusion, period, but built hype for the future of the franchise with the fanbase's major anticipation for the symbiote saga. Insomniac was also smart enough to lay down a ton of groundwork in the first game and its spin-off. Harry has a presence in the first game throughout his research stations across New York, which neatly tie into his narrative in this game, and obviously the reveal about the true nature of his absence late in that narrative are key as well. But they also build really effectively from where the previous games left off. The aftermath of May's death, the growing pains for Peter and MJ's reformed relationship, Peter's job loss, Miles' continued grief after losing his father, and his struggles to maintain his hero/life balance. Some of these things are handled really well, while some feel like they needed an extra plot point or two, but we'll get there eventually. One thing the game did exceptionally well was highlight the aforementioned struggle to balance heroism and life responsibilities. As they say, when Spider-Man wins, Peter loses, and the opening of this game just immediately dives back into that struggle. Peter has to abandon his first day teaching at Brooklyn Visions in order to go stop Sandman, a job he desperately needs after the events of the last game. Likewise, Miles ends up ditching a vitally important college prep meeting to stop Marco as well, but I absolutely cannot express how much joy I experienced in this opening sequence of the game, despite the fact that it's essentially an extended tutorial, which now takes a tad longer given that they need to both intro gameplay for Peter and Miles. This entire battle represents so much that I've wanted to see from a Spidey story, and things I didn't even realize I wanted to see. I had no idea that Kaiju Sandman was something I really needed in a game this badly, Just an overwhelming threat to start the game off on an absolutely epic scale. Even cooler was swinging all the way from Brooklyn to Manhattan with that giant threat on the horizon. But what gave me just an endless dose of serotonin was seeing Miles and Peter as dueling Spideys fully realized. Two Spider-Men working together as partners, having to problem solve on the fly on the biggest scale, utilizing each other's strengths in real time. Obviously, there are still aspects of Peter mentoring Miles in this game, but that's a dynamic we've seen before. The full partnership between the pair hasn't really been seen in this way, and it just got me so stoked. Honestly, the aftermath of this battle was also something I really loved to see for very unexpected reasons. Sandman's tirade leaves Lower Manhattan absolutely buried in sand, with buildings destroyed and people trapped, showcasing not just the Spideys helping the people who were trapped in the sandstorm, but firefighters and first responders as well. Not to be too dramatic, but I would be shocked if the imagery wasn't at least partially inspired by Ground Zero in the wake of 9/11, when this exact area of Manhattan was buried in debris. It's just nice to highlight non-superheroes doing their best to help in the aftermath of a disaster. Where the opening mission in the first game, the takedown of Wilson Fisk, was actually the inciting incident that created the power vacuum in New York City, this game plays it a bit differently. Sandman's attack was actually a warning sign of what would be the major inciting incident for the game.
If you need help, all you have to do is ask.
You're the ones who are gonna need help when they come for you.
This inciting incident is of course Kraven's entrance into New York City, which as we learn has actually already happened. Sandman was just one of his first targets. This is a pretty interesting way to introduce the story, but I think it works really well. Lead off with an absolutely massive threat to really set the stage, and then reveal that this threat was actually just scared of something even worse. I've seen some people complain about the non-Spidey aspects of this game, but to me, they are absolutely quintessential to this Spider-Man experience. Spider-Man doesn't mean anything if we aren't connected to Peter Parker, and the first Peter Parker sequences of the game are genuinely some of my favorites. May's death from the end of the last game is still looming over the events of this one. Peter lives in her house and struggles to pay her mortgage, still stricken with grief from her loss, showcased by his inability to donate any of her old things. I was so thankful that they brought May back in this flashback sequence, one of the best emotional moments of the game, relating to Peter and highlighting exactly what he needs to learn over the course of this story.
Balance is a process, not a destination. I'm still working on that. Oh, come on.
But even more than the May scene, I loved Harry's proper introduction. Obviously, we really only got to infer info about Harry and Pete's relationship through his messages at the research stations and his letter explaining his illness later in the first game. As Spidey fans, we know Peter and Harry's friendship is important, but Insomniac didn't just rush past this important step for these versions of the characters, despite the fact that they're catching back up later in their lives.
I was thinking we might roll like we used to.
I cannot express how much I loved this Peter and Harry mission, just riding bikes from May's house to Midtown High, shooting hoops, catching up, and reminiscing about their childhood together. These are the vitally important human moments that make Spider-Man stories matter. If these relationships don't mean anything to the audience, the Spider-Man stakes don't matter either. The best Spider-Man stories are also fundamentally Peter Parker stories, or Miles Morales stories. I don't care if these sequences aren't action-packed, experiencing these best friends reconnect not only warmed my heart, but went such a long way to establish why this friendship is important to this narrative. And that Shin's needle drop, I mean, come on. In the middle of this, we also get a flashback mission, showing some of the events in their high school days that made Pete and Harry such great friends, coinciding with the most affecting moment in Harry's life, the death of his mother. Not only his biggest loss, but the first realization that he may succumb to the same illness that she did. I love that Harry's research stations in the first game sort of telegraphed his more altruistic nature, inspired by his mother, attempting to utilize Oscorp's tech to actually help the world. It leads perfectly into the narrative here.
I got a second chance, and I'm gonna take advantage of that. But I need you with me, Pete. We're gonna heal the world.
What I think works so great about this storyline for Peter is the way the goals and possibilities of the Emily May Foundation perfectly line up with that all-important mantra, with great power comes great responsibility. Peter is on the fence about helping Harry because of his Spider-Man responsibilities, but the reality of the ambitious nature of Harry and Peter's foundation is that it could help so many people.
When I was in treatment, all I could think about was, what would I do if I survived? And I kept hearing my mom's voice telling me that our planet is in trouble. And it's my responsibility to save it.
I think this genuinely asks an important and daring question for a Spider-Man story. Are there ways that Peter's talents could be better served in regards to great responsibility? Stopping these big threats as a superhero is obviously important, but solving systemic and fundamental problems with the planet we live on could potentially help on a massive, massive scale. I think it's a really interesting idea that this story grapples with, and most importantly, there are personal stakes at the center that tie to the incoming symbiote story very well thematically, but we'll get there soon. This game obviously co-stars Miles, and while there are aspects of his narrative that work very well, I sadly think that he wasn't as intertwined with the overall story nearly as much as I wanted him to be, which is a huge bummer because I truly loved his story in his solo game. It's a tad frustrating because you can sort of see the places where just a little bit more could have gone a really, really long way. That being said, other aspects of his arc are so damn great in isolation. As a new Spider-Man, it makes sense that Miles would struggle even more with his work-life balance, especially with the major life changes that come with prepping for college. They set up a lot of really great stuff here. A scene that particularly moved me was Rio telling Miles about the man she's been dating.
I'm sure there's some spider stuff I can be doing. I can give you some privacy.
No, I'd like him to meet you.
Though I do really wish that this had maybe played a bigger role in the story overall, since Insomniac always hits with these important relationship moments. But the aspect of Miles' story that does absolute hit throughout to the end is his internal struggle with Martin Lee. More on that to come. Let's talk Kraven, because I think they handled his story mostly really effectively. I do think it's fair to argue that having an entire army of hunters isn't exactly the most Kraven thing to do, but I think it mostly works in this game. For one, I just think it's the nature of these kind of video games. There's always got to be some kind of overwhelming threat to the entire city, and I think the story justifies Kraven's actions here, utilizing the army to capture his opponents for him to battle one-on-one. The reveal that he's hunted down and killed the vast majority of Spidey's villains, many of whom we fought in the first game, is such a brutal way to build him up as a threat. But I think the most interesting thing they do with Kraven here are his motivations. They reveal that Kraven has some kind of terminal illness, and that his endless search for a worthy opponent isn't just his ego as a hunter, but his attempts to go out on his own terms. He won't allow illness to make him look weak and end his life in a way that he perceives as pathetic. He wants to go out at the top of his game, dying a death that he feels is worthy of his pedigree. And obviously, he actually succeeds here. I just think that's a really cool take on Kraven. And this is a good lead-in for the symbiote and Venom storyline. And while I wish the Venom section of the game had been a bit more robust, I think the execution of Peter's arc and his symbiote storyline is probably the highlight of the game overall. For one, I think the new entry point into the symbiote arc was a really smart adaptation. I know some people likely have misgivings with them using Harry as Venom instead of Eddie Brock, but I love that they opted to use the symbiote in a new way, as it basically keeps Harry's terminal illness at bay. It thematically ties to Harry and Peter's goals, healing the world, and also gives everyone a more personal connection to its existence. There are way more stakes when the thing keeping your best friend alive is actually an evil you need to destroy. And it makes the scene where the symbiote transfers from Harry to Peter to save his life much more impactful. I've seen a lot of very bad takes that Peter was nerfed in this game, or that they propped up other characters to make him look bad, and I just really wish people were willing to engage with Peter's story here. I just cannot relate to the people who need their favorite characters to be the biggest, strongest boys, rather than empathize with the actual journey the character is going on. May's flashback scene pretty explicitly spells this out and telegraphs exactly why Peter struggles over this narrative: a lack of balance. She tells him about all of the responsibilities she took on in school when she was his age.
Every year, I wanted a new feather in my cap. But when I tried to add honor roll student on top, I fell apart. Instead of being good at a few things, I wasn't good at anything. So, I scaled back.
In the first game, Peter was mostly isolated. He pretty much only spent his time Spider-Manning, and he even got evicted because of it. In this game, Peter now has a girlfriend, he's taken on May's mortgage, and despite his reservations, knowing that it will eat into his responsibility as Spider-Man, he takes on the job at the Emily May Foundation with Harry. He does the opposite of scale back. Peter absolutely struggles over the course of this game, and it isn't to prop up other characters, it's to highlight exactly what he needs to learn, not only as Spider-Man, but especially as Peter Parker. Peter's embrace of the symbiote suit is basically his refusal to actually acknowledge this is an issue. He essentially uses the symbiote as performance-enhancing drugs, and Yuri Lowenthal rightfully played this part of the story as though he was going through an addiction.
I need this suit. It makes me a better Spider-Man. You just want it for yourself.
Peter slowly succumbing to the symbiote is so well done. And, surprise, surprise, it's the section of the narrative where he struggles the least fighting as Spider-Man and struggles the most in his personal life. It's definitely not an accident, guys. They even adapt the iconic sequence where the symbiote uses Peter's body while he's asleep, first seen in Peter Parker, The Spectacular Spider-Man number 95, and expertly adapted in the Spectacular Spider-Man animated series. What I love most about this sequence is that it puts you in MJ's shoes, which really highlights how terrifying Peter has become, basically playing out like a horror movie. And this really shows how deeply Peter has failed in his personal life by embracing the suit, nearly killing MJ in the process. Peter wakes up on a park bench the next morning without a care in the world. He ignores texts from MJ and even from Rio, who is desperately searching for Miles after he was kidnapped by Kraven. And then Peter is immediately awful to Harry, who is now dying without the symbiote.
This suit is the only reason I'm still alive.
Yeah, it's pretty great, isn't it?
Why don't you pop some more pills and say what you're really feeling?
Hey, don't.
Peter slowly losing himself as the suit takes over is so well handled. Easily one of my favorite aspects of the narrative, both in execution and how it ties to the story thematically. Sadly, despite really high highs, I think the symbiote story loses a bit of steam after the introduction of Venom. But that's such a key aspect of the climax, let's talk about some other villains first. This game does an unbelievable job implementing so many iconic villains and side characters into the gameplay and narrative. Obviously, the opening tutorial kaiju fight with Sandman is incredible, but that's just how the game opens. There is a massive multi-part chase and fight with the Lizard. The implementation of Kurt Connors into the story was really well handled. There's clearly a history with Spidey, but he's been given a second chance, trying to help Harry and Norman reel in the symbiote as a treatment for Harry's condition. I particularly loved how we saw the more familiar Lizard design from the comics, more humanoid with the lab coat, before he further mutated into his massive monster, thanks to Kraven's interference. A really cool video gamey way to escalate the threat without ignoring the character's history. All of these sequences also went a long way to help sell Peter succumbing to the symbiote's influence, as taking down a literal dinosaur isn't exactly the easiest task. One of the highlights of the game is a mission and fight sequence involving Miles, Felicia, and a wand that can create portals, heisted from the Sanctum Sanctorum. For one, on a technical and visual level, this is just top tier, unbelievable stuff. As Miles, you're chasing Felicia through New York City while she jumps around using this portal magic. You seamlessly traverse huge distances, cruising through each portal in real time. My jaw was on the floor for the entire sequence. It's also, I think, a fun use of larger Marvel lore, which in general I feel mixed about in these games. While we don't see Doctor Strange, it's clear he and Wong were protecting this wand, and we even get a Wong name drop when they take the wand back after the mission. Sometimes it's hard to believe that such massive threats would go completely unimpeded by other heroes like the Avengers, when they clearly have a presence in New York in this universe, given Avengers Tower. Not that I want the Avengers to show up in this game, I'd personally prefer it to be more Spidey focused, but referencing the larger universe sometimes makes it feel muddier and less believable. But I guess that could just be a quirk of this universe. I'm very curious if things will build out in this world even further with the upcoming Wolverine game, but regardless, I thought this smaller reference to Doctor Strange and Wong worked really well in this case. I also really love that they opted to have Miles undertake this Felicia mission, forcing both of them to make judgment calls about people they don't have any real history with. Felicia doesn't know if she can trust Miles, and Miles has been explicitly told that he can't trust Felicia. He's put on the spot and has to make his own decision about Felicia's intentions.
Spider-Man was right about you. You only care about yourself.
Look, kid. Not that it's your business. My girlfriend's in Paris. And I got her into trouble with some bad people. Have you ever done something for love?
This is such a great Spider-Man moment for Miles. While Miles has really come into his own as Spidey over these 3 games, he still looks to Peter and MJ for advice, especially going into a situation like this one, with an adversary he's unfamiliar with. So to be told explicitly not to trust Felicia, but then to make his own decision in the heat of the moment, one that prioritizes the well-being of others, perfectly Spider-Man. These are important steps for Miles as he grows as a hero, and while I still have some issues with how Miles was implemented into the story overall, there are some clear exceptions, particularly as mentioned before with his Martin Lee arc. This entire story is played so beautifully, with Miles unexpectedly seeing Lee as he's being transferred and leading to a story-long struggle with his feelings of vengeance. I've seen some people question the story point, and I honestly just have to question that media literacy, as though seeing the man responsible for his father's death face to face wouldn't be deeply traumatizing, especially when it wasn't expected and ends with that man's escape. The Miles and Lee plot points are some of the highlights of the game, with Kraven even forcing the pair to fight each other in a gladiator-like arena after he kidnaps both of them. A really wild setup for a great boss fight, ending with Miles once again making a heroic decision and showing that he's working towards rejecting the feelings of vengeance that he's been struggling with.
When you're out, find Spider-Man.
While Lee has obviously done unforgivable things, I think they do a great job showcasing his deep regret for giving in to his vengeance. He could have fled after Miles saved him, but he actually found Peter and told him where to find Miles, which leads to another of the best sequences in the game, Peter's fight with Kraven, and then with Miles. The Peter v. Kraven fight is excellent, showing Peter give in to some of his worst symbiote tendencies, while Kraven acknowledges that despite this, he still hasn't fully given in.
Beautiful. But you still hold back. Kill or be killed.
God, this image of symbiote Peter holding Kraven goes so hard, but this leads into probably my favorite boss fight of the entire game, as well as, to me, the peak emotional moment.
All I want is to save you.
I'm the hero. I don't get sick.
Miles being forced to fight his mentor and friend to rescue him from the pits of his addiction is so raw, so emotional. I think it is far and away the best depiction of Peter overcoming the symbiote that we've ever seen, and it fits the ideas and themes behind the suit's control so perfectly. The classic bell tower scene is obviously iconic for a reason, but with the way this story treats the suit like an addiction, something Peter slowly becomes dependent on at the expense of his loved ones, it's so much more beautiful to see that addiction be overcome through an intervention from somebody who actually cares about him.
I can't let this go. I'm finally everything everyone needs me to be.
Yeah? You don't even answer my calls anymore, man. What about MJ? You could have killed her. I know you're hurting, Pete, but you're better than this.
I know, but no.
The way that Peter rips the symbiote off of himself with the vocal support from Miles is genuinely perfect. It shows that without the support of his loved ones, Peter wouldn't have overcome this struggle, a struggle with something that is simply more powerful than himself, which ties beautifully to those allusions to addiction, as well as the major arc and lesson Peter needs to reconcile with in this game, that after 10 years of being Spider-Man, he cannot do everything himself. He needs to accept help where he can and find balance in his life.
Miles, I'm sorry. Thank you for everything.
It's what Spider-Man do.
Spider-Man didn't save me back there. Miles did.
It's so sad to me to see some people complain about these aspects of the story simply because they don't think Miles should be able to beat a symbiote-powered Peter. Besides the fact that Miles didn't beat him, if you can't understand the thematic resonance and appreciate the struggles of the characters in the story being told, are you even interested in storytelling? Peter overcoming an overwhelming power with the support of his friends and loved ones is so much more Spider-Man than some power fantasy face-off. This game is filled with some absolutely major high points like this one, some of my favorite moments I've experienced in any Spider-Man media. The conclusion of the Miles and Martin Lee arc is the other aspect of Miles' story that absolutely hits. The narrative did such a great job showcasing the trauma from Miles' father's death unexpectedly consuming him. In the heat of the moment, he's faced with something he hadn't really even considered. And this all culminates in one of my favorite sequences, Lee and Miles working together inside of Peter's subconscious, getting to the core of his deepest traumas and helping him unlock the anti-venom suit. Part of why I love this is because of what it tells us about Peter, but first I want to talk about how beautifully it ties up Miles' arc. Miles is literally forced to team up with the source of his deepest trauma here, knowing it's something he has to do for the good of his friend. But it gives him the opportunity to understand Lee and his actions on a more fundamental level, which in turn helps him learn to be a better hero and a better person.
Why did you do it? What did you want?
Revenge. Norman Osborn's the reason my parents are dead. So I dedicated my life to making his hell. Instead, you lost your father. Peter lost May. And I was too stubborn to see I had become what I despised most. I'm sorry, Miles.
Miles was the next in line in a cycle of trauma and vengeance. Norman's actions killed Lee's parents. Lee's actions killed Miles' father. But Miles broke the cycle by not giving in to that vengeance, despite feeling it.
I won't forgive you. It's just not in me. But I can't carry this hate for you anymore, man. So let's set things right. You and me.
Miles proved himself to be a real hero by acknowledging the pain and hurt Lee inflicted on him, refusing to forgive him, but still pushing forward and being the better man, moving on and breaking that cycle. It's a great arc for the character, and it also once again brings everything back to Norman Osborn. Everything in Insomniac's Spider-Man universe can be traced back to Norman Osborn. Unfortunately, these are the best examples of Miles being properly intertwined with Peter's narrative in this game. I love his involvement in helping Peter remove the symbiote suit and his arc in the Martin Lee saga, but probably my biggest issue with the game as a whole is that Miles feels separated from the narrative a lot of the time, which is a big missed opportunity, and it prevents the ending beats from feeling as satisfying as they could have. But in order to properly analyze all of that, we've got to go over the remainder of the Venom arc. I think the fact that Insomniac found a new in for the symbiote story is wildly impressive. Obviously, the key aspects are still there. It's a living being from space that fuses with its host, but the idea that the symbiotic abilities are being harnessed to heal Harry's illness is so effective in this story. I was a tad concerned when they announced that Venom would be someone it hasn't been in the comics, but in execution, I think it mostly worked great. For one, we get a truly, genuinely loving friendship between Peter and Harry here, probably the most wholesome we've ever seen them, which really adds to the emotional stakes. Not just the stakes of trying to rescue Harry after he's fused with the suit and become Venom, but the stakes while you're wearing the symbiote as Peter, knowing that Harry is succumbing to his illness without the symbiote's aid, and the sad realization that it is far too dangerous to actually give the symbiote back to Harry.
I saved your life! You won't save mine? Do you want me to die?
On top of that, the resentment that built up in Harry while Peter was using the suit is exactly what drew the symbiote back to Harry and caused him to mutate into Venom, making Pete feel responsible for the fate of his friend and the havoc he wreaked upon New York City. I'm a broken record, but these games do such a great job adding relationship-based emotional stakes to all of the actual superhero drama. It's the secret sauce. But how can you talk about Venom without raving about how much fun it is to play as him in this Oscorp breakout sequence? I had so much fun throughout this entire game, but the 10 to 20 minutes where you are Venom, busting through walls, just throwing guards into oblivion, next level stuff. Obviously culminating in one of the most hardcore sequences we've ever seen in Spider-Man. Venom versus Kraven. The fight isn't particularly hard, but I think this accomplishes two things. For one, it almost makes it feel like a reward for the difficult battles leading up to this point, and two, it makes Venom feel like an absolutely unstoppable force. After a tough fight against Kraven earlier, experiencing Venom just absolutely decimate Kraven really makes you wonder how the hell you're ever going to stop Venom himself as Spider-Man. I don't think I need to say much about the decapitation scene, just an absolutely unreal moment in Spidey history. I lost my mind. I also really love the idea that Harry's wants and desires are fully meshing with the symbiotes, but the symbiote is still using Harry. The scene after where he goes to his mother's grave is excellent.
What did I just do?
Don't be scared, honey. You finally have the power to do what we've always wanted. We're going to heal the world.
This manipulation from the symbiote / Venom works really well here. By using the symbiote as a device that has literally healed Harry of his illness, and then combining that with his desire to do right by his mother and heal the world, you've got a pretty ingenious reframing of a symbiote takeover of Earth. The symbiote wanting to consume the world and add it to the hive mind, and Harry wanting to rid the world of its illnesses and issues. All that being said, I think a lot of the stretch of the game from Venom's introduction through to the final battle leaves leaves a bit to be desired. There are still a ton of great moments in isolation. This is where we get the wrap up of Miles and Martin Li's arc, which I already raved about. Plus, there's an incredible boss battle against MJ as Scream, but as a whole, it feels a bit undercooked. As a spectacle, Peter vs. MJ's Scream is next level. The Scream design is amazing, and the fight is a ton of fun, but I think they missed the mark laying the groundwork for the relationship struggles at its core. As with many great Insomniac Spidey conflicts, the relationship at the center is key. During the fight, MJ/Scream unloads all of her resentments about their relationship and his life as Spider-Man that she's been keeping pent up inside. And I think that's a great idea on paper. I just don't think the game did enough to pre-establish these resentments. There is some groundwork, Peter refusing to accept MJ's help early in the game, and obviously treating everyone badly while he was ensnared with the symbiote suit, but I think they could have done a bit more to really showcase how Peter's double life itself was negatively affecting MJ. The symbiote suit feels like such a specific circumstance. I would have preferred to see a bit more of the difficulties associated with just being Spider-Man's girlfriend. That can't be easy. As I mentioned before, I also think Miles' integration into the story overall could have been handled much better. There are some really great ideas in regards to Peter's relationship with both Harry and Miles, and how the evolution of those friendships could create resentment between the two of them. For the small section of the game where Harry becomes Agent Venom and sort of takes Miles' place as he and Peter start doing superhero stuff together, it's clear that this starts to draw out some insecurities from Miles, with Peter ignoring him more and more often. But at the end of the game, Harry/Venom really lays into Miles, claiming that he's become Harry's replacement in Peter's life. And I think this is a great idea that is sadly half-baked in this story. We definitely see how Miles starts to resent Pete during the Harry situation, but we never see anything in regards to Harry's resentment of Miles. This would have been a perfect place to tie more of Miles into the main story. What we should have gotten was one mission where Miles teams up with Harry's Agent Venom. We could have seen them get a bit competitive in regards to their relationship with Pete and their crime fighting. Harry having a longer relationship with Peter, but Miles having more Spider-Man experience with him. It could have built out their unique relationship to be a bit more compelling, while also really forecasting how those resentments could build up once Harry is full-blown Venom. We've also got to talk about Miles' new suit, which has obviously been discussed a lot on social media already, though that's mostly been design focused. I actually don't think the design is all that bad, but the color palette really sucks. The alternate palettes already go a long way to improve how the suit looks, even though the hair out of the top is not my preference. But I don't have nearly as much of an issue with the suit as I do the complete lack of any reason for it to have happened in the narrative. Miles literally just pops in towards the end of the game with the new suit on. We never see him create it, and the justification just feels really weak.
It's time for a Miles Morales original, you know?
I don't dislike the idea of Miles sporting a new suit after going through a change. It worked like gangbusters in the Spider-Man Miles Morales game, but if you're not going to justify it in the story, why even do it? Why present it in such an anticlimactic way? It actually feels like there's just a missing story beat between the wrap-up of the Martin Li arc and this scene with the introduction of the suit. So much of Miles' journey in his solo game and in this game are about the community that he's surrounded himself with. I would have loved to see his personal relationships in his community play a role in the creation of his new suit. One of the key side characters in his life is Haley, who just so happens to know Miles' secret identity and is a street artist. What if we got a scene after the Martin Li wrap-up where Miles opens up to Haley about letting go of that vengeance, about moving forward with his life, and about how he feels like a new person because of the weight that is lifted? And what if Haley then used her street art abilities to help Miles design a new suit? That obviously doesn't have to be how it goes down. I just think there's a missing piece here. And if you're not going to bridge that gap, don't make the new suit a story point. That's just my take. There are just a handful of these totally solid ideas, many of which really lend themselves to the themes of the game, but in execution aren't quite robust enough to feel fully justified. Combine this with the fact that I just don't think they utilized Miles quite thoroughly enough in the overall narrative, and sadly, it's enough for me to say that compared to the previous two games, I found this one to be a tad underwhelming. Of course, as I've gushed about a ton of the game already, I still had an all-around incredible experience. I just didn't feel the same level of emotional impact that I did at the end of the first game, or even the Miles Morales game. But for some of its main story shortcomings, there are so many absolutely peak Spider-Man moments in the side content. Here's a tip: if you didn't play the Flame side missions, do that. Following up Yuri Watanabe's dismissal as police captain from the Spider-Man PS4 DLC, she's now operating as another vigilante, Wraith. These missions do a great job showing Peter and Yuri attempting to reconcile their weird relationship after the events of that DLC, with them both having drastically different ideas ideas of what is and isn't okay in their vigilantism. But the major reveal at the end of these missions is that the homicidal cult leader of the Flame that you've been tracking the entire time is none other than Cletus Cassidy, or at least that's one of his false identities. And his entire plan was to retrieve one of the symbiotes being kept by Oscorp. I have a strong feeling that this is their big narrative plan for the DLC. A lot of fans were underwhelmed by Hammerhead in the first game's extra content. With this in mind, and Carnage being such a massively popular character, I am fully expecting we'll be getting substantial Carnage-focused DLC down the line. But even beyond these exciting Spidey setups, I think where the game really shines is in its smaller, more human moments. Obviously, the main missions have a few of these. The bike ride with Harry, the trio hanging out at Coney Island in particular, but there are a couple optional side missions that, to me, are just perfect. There's one in Brooklyn where you have to track down a woman's missing grandfather. You run around Brooklyn going to various places he visits until you find him on a park bench and you just sit with him while you wait for his granddaughter.
I proposed to my wife here, right here, where we sit.
Man, you're making the rest of us look bad. How'd you ask?
These moments of human connection are what makes Spider-Man a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. The connection to the people he saves is so vital to that Spider-Man experience, and I think this is actually something they continued from the Miles Morales spin-off and fully improved upon from the first Spider-Man game, where sometimes the missions could start to feel a bit too much like you're just a spider cop. A genuine focus on the people that Spider-Man helps. But there isn't any better example than the Howard side mission. You might remember Howard in the first game as the guy you had to collect pigeons for. A bit of a tedious collectathon, but over the course of that mission, you learn about Howard and that he watches over the pigeons in honor of his dead wife. This time, Howard asks you to find a place for those pigeons to relocate, but not before you sit with him while he just observes the beauty that the city has to offer, looking out over the water, reflecting on his life.
I'm finally going on an adventure, but I want to set my birds free first. Let them see the world outside this city.
NYC is the best place in the world for pigeons,
Can you take them up north for me? Somewhere peaceful?
But they need you, Howard.
It's their time.
As you escort the birds to their new home, the vibes are just genuinely immaculate. Needle dropping the song Seabird by the Alessi brothers. I cannot describe the emotions I felt just flying across the river helping these birds find their new home. I've never experienced anything like it in a video game, and as I'm sure many figured out, this was Howard's goodbye, his last act to watch over those birds and do right by them.
He's on a new adventure now, and his wife's with him.
I don't think Spider-Man 2 is a perfect game, but in its best moments, it is truly special. And even though I think the story could have been a bit more cohesive overall, I also think that it still really hits in its biggest emotional moments. The final battle with Venom is mostly really great. I particularly loved that the first part takes place at Midtown High, where you became friends with Harry, and the second takes place at the Emily May Foundation, where they reconnected in their desire to help the world. I do wish that the second half of this fight had been a tag team effort with Miles, mostly because this is where the lack of substance in the Harry/Miles relationship was really showcased. Putting Peter back in the picture would add more of the emotional stakes. However, when the big emotional moments between Peter and Harry arrived, they hit.
Let's heal the world, Pete. Together.
Peter was intent on not losing someone else, not after May, but Peter doesn't get to choose.
I love you.
Though we do have this great moment where Miles resuscitates Harry, he still ends up in a vegetative state. It's clear that they're using Norman's grief and last-ditch efforts to save Harry to kickstart the Green Goblin story, which I'm really looking forward to, but for all intents and purposes, in this moment, Peter loses Harry. Just after getting his best friend back, he loses him. And this is why I think this game does a really great job selling the idea that Peter needs a break as Spidey. It's all about balance. And with the physical and emotional burden weighing on Peter after 10 years of being Spider-Man without a break, Peter has lost that balance. When Miles and Lee are navigating Peter's subconscious, we see the literal corpses of Spidey's villains ensnared in the symbiote, telling us that these events leave a lasting traumatic impact on Peter. They never really leave him, even after he's won a battle or saved the day. And of course, there's the fact that Peter is obviously still reeling from the loss of May, his last family by blood. He lost his mentor and role model in the previous story. He's lost his best friend in this one, and while struggling to maintain that balance, he gave himself to an evil outside force that nearly ruined his relationships, nearly killed MJ, the love of his life. By taking a Spidey hiatus, Peter can reform the Emily May Foundation. He can use his other great power to take up great responsibility, help people on a more systemic and foundational level. And with Miles capable and willing to take up that mantle of Spider-Man, giving the city the hope that Peter knows it needs, Peter can enter this new chapter knowing the world is in good hands. Not just because the city still has Spider-Man, but because of the work he can do without that obligation that will also help change the world. Peter found his balance. And no, I don't think that means he's done being Spider-Man, because as we know, there's still one final chapter to come. And with the tease of Cindy Moon's Silk, the prospect of Green Goblin entering the picture, and even of Doc Ock returning, there are so many more Spidey stories to tell, and I cannot wait to see them.
I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust a move.